Hi, I'm Sune, and I'm a food geek. Over the last 1.5 years, I've developed this tool called Bread Calculator, which is a tool that I think most bakers would be really happy to use. I started making it for myself, but over time, people would ask for features and I would add them, and it's become this really nice product with a lot of different options that aren't too difficult to figure out. So let me explain to you how this works. There's at the top we have these buttons that do different things. I'll start by explaining what those are. This new formula button just erases everything and makes you start over. The total weight button scales the recipe from a new total weight. The flour button scales the recipe from the total flour weight. The hydration button changes the dough to a new hydration. The From Yeast button changes a yeasted recipe, to sourdough. The tangzhong button changes the recipe to a recipe with tangzhong in the correct proportions. The inoculation button changes the inoculation of the starter in the dough, which means the amount of starter, because we use that when we want to change how long the fermentation is. So if we need a longer fermentation, we'll put in less starter. If we need a faster fermentation, we'll put in more starter. Then the link button saves your recipe. It copies a short link to the clipboard, which means if you want to save it, you can go to your favorite text editor, or let's say Word or some other word processing program, and you can paste it in there and you can always get back to the recipe. And then the last button is the print button, which helps you print off the recipe so that you can bring it to your kitchen table. I don't know about you, but my iPad isn't waterproof. Let's look at how you build a bread. You can name your bread. We'll call this test bread. And you can add your name. Then we can add the ingredients. In this case, we'll start out. What I do is I use percentages or per mil. So based on 1,000. So I will go 1,000 grams of flour. It's easy to calculate with. So I will say 800 grams of bread flour. 200 grams of rye flour. Then we'll just start out with 800 grams of water. We can change that later with the hydration button. 200 grams of starter. That's 20% inoculation, because it's 20% of 1,000 grams of flour, which is the total here. You can see you can also set the hydration. If you have a different hydrated starter, you can set what it is so you get the correct hydration calculation. And we need some salt, 20 grams of salt. All right, so let's look at the vitals over here. We have a bread that weighs a little bit more than 2 kilos, which is a pretty huge loaf. 100 grams, about 9.1% are already fermented, which means they're part of the starter. If you add a levain, a pre-ferment, that will also be pre-fermented, because it's expected that you feed this and then you use it in the dough. Then there's 1,100 grams of flour, where the 100 grams is from the starter. There's 900 grams of fluid, where 100 grams is from the starter, and 20% of salt, which is 1.8% in the total bread, and a hydration of almost 82%. All right, I think most people will think that 82% is a little bit on the high side, so we'll change that first. We'll change to, let's say, 75%. What happens is that it changes the amount of water in the recipe, which means that it will now weigh less. And then we can change the total to a number of what you'd want one loaf to be. I usually go for 700, but let's say you want a little bit of a bigger bread, then you can say 900. Press OK. And it changes the entire recipe so that the bread will weigh 900 grams. Let's say that you want to bake 2 breads instead of 1. You could, of course, say, well, 2 times 900 is 1800, and then use the total button. But we also have this system over here where it says this is for 1 of whatever this is. And you can of course change this if it was for 2. But instead we're going to scale from this. So we'll say I want 2 breads. And it changes everything, and you can go whatever you want. If you want 4 breads, you can see 3,600. It just changes everything for you. All right, and then what we talked about earlier, let's say it's a very warm day, so you want less starter. Instead of 20%, you want maybe 10%. Press the inoculation button, and then you type 10. And what it does is that it changes the amount of starter in here, and then that would actually make the hydration go down, because the hydration is 100% of the starter, and the bread is less than that. So if you have less starter, the water level will go down, but it then scales it back up to 75%, and it scales the total weight up to 1,800 grams again, whatever it was set to before the inoculation button was pressed. Let's say it's a more hydrated bread. So let's say it's 95%, which is totally crazy. We'll turn that back down to 1,800. Then you can use a tangzhong, which means that you cook the flour and some water to gelatinize part of the flour. That helps the water being bound into some of the flour, so the perceived hydration is a lot lower. But you still get a bread that has a much longer shelf life because it has more water in it. So if you press this button, you can make a tangzhong from the existing recipe. A good place to start is about 20%, but I've done breads that have up to 40%. But let's just try this. What happens, we'll scroll a bit here. What happens is it takes part of the flour and part of the water and makes it into the tangzhong, and then of course it's subtracted from these. It starts from the top for grabbing the flour, or if you have more lines of fluid, it will start from the top. So maybe you want to move them around if you wanted to take it from a specific item. So let's say you have water and you have milk. You don't want to use the milk for the tangzhong, then you put the water on top. Or let's say I wanted to use the rye flour, then I would have moved it up top. All right, then the last thing I want to show you is that you can scale the recipe from one specific item. So there's a scale with each line here, and let's say you want to add 500 grams of bread flour because that's all you have left. Then it scales the entire recipe to suit that. But let's say you want it to be from the rye flour because you only have 300 grams of rye flour and you want to use that up. You can scale the entire recipe from this. It's pretty useful, I think. The next thing I want to show you is a new feature in the bread calculator, and that is a feature that helps you calculate the perceived hydration of an enriched dough. The problem is with enriched doughs is that usually there's not very much fluid in there. There's eggs, milk, butter, and those all have water in them. But do you know how much? Well, I didn't either, so I made this list and then I added it to my bread calculator so that you can get the correct number from that. So this is my blueberry swirl sourdough brioche bread that I made. It's a really great recipe. I'm linking it in the card above if you haven't tried it. But the problem is that, as you can see, the hydration is 25%. And that's because there's some water in eggs, there's some water in milk, a lot of water in milk. There's some water in butter, but these are all set up, if we just press edit, as other extras, or in case of butter, it's just other extras. So you don't really get any idea about the fat content, and you don't get an idea about the hydration. So what we'll do is that we'll change this recipe into the new system. So 200 grams of eggs, we'll choose this one, and it's whole eggs. You have the option of just yolks or just whites or whole eggs. Press OK, and now we see that the hydration suddenly jumps from 25% to almost 55%. Also, a bit of fat has been added from the egg. And then we'll change the milk, and we'll choose dairy, and there's a whole list of different things that you can set. It defaults to whole milk, but there's all these skim milks, low-fat milk, and there's creams, there's yogurt, there's butter, salted and unsalted which you can't see unsalted, but it's down here. But in this case, we'll just say whole milk is great. You also have all these values, which helps you calculate the hydration. So let's say you have a milk that has different macronutrients than my milk. You can add them here and you can press calculate and it'll figure out what the hydration is. You can also just use it the way it is. It'll be close enough. But it's for those people who really want it to be 100% correct, which I like that too. All right, let's press OK. You can see the hydration actually went a little bit down. And the fat went up. And now the butter. And we'll select dairy and then butter unsalted. All right, that means the perceived hydration is somewhere around 65%. There's a whopping 62.7% fat, which is insane. I know it's insane, but it's honestly the best bread I ever tasted. Also the only bread I didn't want to add any butter to afterwards. All right. That is it for the bread calculator. If you have any ideas for this and you wanna let me know, tell me in the comments what would you like for this, or do you just really love it, or do you hate it? Let me know in the comments. If you come up with a good idea, I will be more than happy to add it to this so that we can get an even better tool. All right, I hope you learned something today. See you next time.